and welcome to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. And today, joining me is Vivian Taylor, who is not a uh, new to this channel at all. You've been on here a few times now, and a regular on the channel.
Number 4.
Yeah, I think so. I was thinking 4 or 5, something like that. Yeah.
Wow.
But yeah, I always love getting you on because, well, first of all, you do have your Master's of Divinity, and so you have some education in this and high level education, but also you and I are interested in a lot of the same areas. Sort of that little space between first and third century, that's that area of time. There's just so much going on. And we were talking about Plotinus, and I have the Penguin Classics over here, and there's a specific chapter called Against the Gnostics, where he sort of goes after these dualists that he's not really a big fan of. Apparently, some of his students are into this stuff. He wants to refute them. But there's also Paul in 1 Corinthians 8, and if it's in the English, you might not catch it. But if you're reading it in Greek, he's talking about Gnosis. He's talking about this concept of Gnosis. And, we all possess Gnosis, but the knowledge puffs up while love builds up. And he's sort of going into this idea of certain Christians have the Gnosis, but the ones who don't have it, we sort of need to protect them like sheep, like we're shepherds and they're sheep. And so there's a lot going on there. And I know you've been digging deep into this. I'm just barely scratching the surface on this stuff, but I wanted to sort of set the ground, set the stage on what the topics are, because I want to see how this connects to what Plotinus is getting at. And the floor is yours, and I'm glad to have you back on.
Yeah, it's really good to be here. I always appreciate getting to talk to you. Your audience tends to be nice to me, so I enjoy that. I am so excited to get to talk about this tonight because this is one of the weirder parts of Paul, and it's one of those books, 1 Corinthians. I grew up Southern Baptist. 1 Corinthians is a favorite book when you need a clobber passage about, the man is the head of the woman, this is how a marriage should be. Women shouldn't talk in church. No homosexuality. A lot of these are pulling from 1 Corinthians. And so I think if you, hey, I'm, in the LGBT community, I think if you're growing up in that world, a book like 1 Corinthians can seem like an especially thorny, painful text to look at. However, let me tell you, it is absolutely fascinating if you go in from the perspective of thinking about Gnosticism. So to understand 1 Corinthians, here's a little of the historical context and background. And of course, there are different perspectives on different things. If you feel like someone out there in TV land, in YouTube land, if y'all catch me in something particularly egregious, just let me know. I'm learning, I'm growing, I'm doing my best. So we are kind of in the middle of St. Paul's career here. Paul, this is after Galatians. Paul has been traveling around preaching a gospel similar to what we are getting in the book of Galatians for a while, which is highly inclusive, highly, the letter kills and the spirit gives life kind of thing. One of these churches is in Corinth. And once again, there are different perspectives, but it seems like the consensus view is that this is largely a Greek church. These are not really Jewish. These are not like Jewish converts to Christianity, but rather like Greek Hellenistic pagan converts to Christianity. And within this church, there are a number of issues. This is in the heart of Greece. So there are two groups that are sometimes referred to as the weak and the strong. And they are having a great deal of conflict with one another. Now, as students of Gnosticism, you've never heard this before, but there's one group within this group of Christians who believes that they have a secret special gnosis that is the gnosis of Christ, that is different from the gnosis of the world, and that because they have that gnosis, they can do things that might not be allowed otherwise. A big example being eating meat sacrificed to idols. Now, this goes back to the thing in the ancient Hellenistic world where, like, there isn't like a butcher. According to what I've read, there were about as many feast days as like we have Sundays in the modern world, more or less. So you're having regular breaks and cattle are being sacrificed, and you can get some of the beef from the cattle.
Yeah.
So this is a big deal because all of these cattle are technically being sacrificed to deities. So this is like, I mean, and hey, this is a similar thing to like when sacrifices are made in the Jewish temple, how it's a really big deal who gets to eat that meat. Like it's a big deal. But in Corinth, the group who believe they have gnosis, that they have this special gnosis, think that that they are aware that either the gods don't exist or are bad, and therefore it doesn't really matter if meat is sacrificed to them because it just doesn't matter. I mean, who cares? They're just, I mean, what are we afraid of archons over here?
That's what Paul's saying. He says it in a very cocky way, just like that too.
Oh yeah, no.
You're afraid of their gods? Who cares about their gods?
I mean, genuinely, one that like I think if you look at the historical letters of Paul, like Paul is really negative on low-level deities and angels. He's aware of them. He doesn't trust them. I mean, he even in the book of Galatians, like, I mean, and it's kind of a shocking thing. And I'm aware that it has been misinterpreted, but I mean, he sort of condemns the Torah, the law of Moses, by saying that it was brought by an angel, opposing it to Christianity, which was brought by, God self, which is just a wild claim to make.
People don't realize that. Like, that's for someone to say that and claim that they were raised by the feet of Gamaliel. And we look at Gamaliel in the Talmud and what he's saying. What? Are you sure this is the same Gamaliel? This is not. That's way out of the league of Judaism.
Right. I mean, absolutely. You can see why there was conflict.
Yeah.
But in Corinth, there is a big fight between these factions going on. And there's a faction who's like, hey, y'all are eating like food sacrificed to idols. And in addition to this, there seem to be fights over whether people should be able to get married. Like, should everybody be celibate or can you get married? And Paul comes down to, it's better to be celibate, but you can get married. But there also seems to be a lot of sexual impropriety in the church. There is, there is one of the most shocking things in the Bible that I think is sort of written around. Is it in, Paul is saying, hey, there is something going on among you, a form of sexual immorality that even the pagans would not do. There is a man having sex with his father's wife. And there's even when I was growing up in church, there's a popular thing, but that's a stepmother. But the way Paul says it, like, this could, hey, and everybody, I'm about to say
Paul's
something.
Hey,
it could literally, it is literally a case of motherfucking. Like, it is and there's a real question about what this means and how this is connected to this gnosis that people claim to have. And you'll notice that Paul never condemns the gnosis itself. Well, that's one of the things that Paul really does that's weird here. And so I promise this is all going to connect to Plotinus.
Yeah.
So if you look at scholarly interpretations of what is going on here. Oh, and by the way, all that stuff about talking about marriage in the second half of First Corinthians, the stuff about, God is the head of the man and the man is the head of the wife, but also talking about how like the wife's body does not belong to her, but to the husband, and the husband's body doesn't belong to him. Okay, all of that is written in the context of this conflict between these two groups in the Corinthian church that Paul refers to as the weak and the strong. What the strong means is the strong are the ones who think that they have gnosis.
Right.
So Paul's big deal is neither really condemning either side, but rather being like, hey guys, get over it and work together.
Yeah, stop boasting, basically.
Yeah, which is, but he's also saying he's also trying to set boundaries. And like, this is a place where you get language that's sometimes translated as homosexuality, but there's a lot of other ways. And because he's specifically talking about idols and women in church, and he uses words for like prostitutes. This seems like this could also be a case. Like, what in the Greco-Roman world has prostitutes and women in church and or women in worship and mystery cults? Like temple prostitution. So it's also possible that some of these words that we are trying to put these later understandings on are discussions of temple prostitution, because also we know that Gnosticism often gets involved with magic, and magic often gets involved with sex magic, because if you want to do sex magic regularly, it helps to have a class of temple prostitutes. And I know that sounds weird, but here we are.
And that's what the world was like, though.
Yeah, and it's not 100% that that's what Paul's saying.
Right.
But so there are all these people who come to this and we say, so is this quote unquote Gnosticism that is having in Corinth? Because, and so you've had a lot of scholarly fights over the last 100 years where people like are trying to either argue for or against what's happening in Corinth as fitting a specific model of Gnosticism. Like, and there are people who say, well, Gnosticism requires a full dichotomy where there are two equal but opposite powers. And there's some people who say, no, it requires the Jewish God specifically to be framed as an evil figure, and the physical world has to be all bad. And so what happens is, if this were a wrestling match, you would hear the sound of breaking glass and someone saying, "Bogdan, that's queer theory's music." It's very hard to define what Gnosticism actually is.
Well, the reason for that, because, and you're right, someone would come in and say, but what about those people? But what about, because there's what we call Gnostics contains a lot of groups that are not the same. And not all of them see the demiurge as the evil. Some of them see them as all good, like Plato's monad or whatever. So we have to keep in mind the Gnostic umbrella has its tentacles in all these different groups who don't think the same. So that's why I try to avoid that word, but I use it because it's easy to just Gnostics. We know what we're talking about. But
and it's also the name of your channel, I notice.
Yeah. but still, I know. So that's what I'm saying. I know what you're saying. Like when you talk about how Gnostics view the Old Testament God, or what they believe in, or what is the Gnostic doctrine? Well, it depends on is it the Sethians? Is it the Carpocratians? Is it the Valentinians? Is it the Noetians? There's like 30 of these groups. The list is long. And they all have their own thing. They're not all the same. Some of them are very similar. Valentinians and Sethians have a lot of overlap, but the Carpocratians they're in their own league over there. So yeah, that's when I keep that in mind when I'm talking about these groups. But yeah, for the most part, and I think is that what you're getting at? You think that Plotinus is sort of he's sort of generalizing a lot of groups into one thing.
More, what I want to use Plotinus for tonight is because there are so many different modern definitions of Gnosticism, I figured, well, why don't we're not reaching all the way back to the first century, but I mean, Plotinus is like what, late second, early third century, something like that. Why don't we use Plotinus's condemnation of Gnosticism just as a goof to go through and look at not only what Paul is saying about the weak and the strong categories, but Paul himself in responding to these two groups in Corinth in the first century. Would these groups count as Gnostics under Plotinus's schema? Because remember, Plotinus's school had Christian and Hellenistic and other students there.
Absolutely.
So, like, I mean, and I will admit, I am not the world's biggest Plotinus scholar. I have not read Life of Plotinus in full before coming on this program. And you all have my deepest apologies, but I'm doing
nobody. I don't think anyone's, unless you like talk to an actual expert in Plotinus, is going to be able to, because that's heavy stuff. There's a lot of like terms like Plotinus is that's heavy. A lot to learn there. It's like Proclus. It's like you can't just read Proclus and figure it out. You're gonna have to be looking up terms and definitions. There's a lot going on there, especially with these Neoplatonists. It's like there's so much going on. There's all these different triads and theurgy. What's that? Like there's all types of weird terminology involved in these people. But yeah, we'll be all right.
I mean,
this is not like we're doing an exam here, so.
Hey, no, look, if somebody wants to give me a grade, I'll take it. But I think I think Plotinus is a really interesting figure because also I think one of the real problems, and I saw this even reading through different scholarly perspectives on First Corinthians. There is one scholarly perspective on First Corinthians that was big in like the teens of the 2010s, and it is so stupid that like what it says is, what's really going on in Corinth is there are secular sophist teachers who are famous for their rhetoric. And so what Paul is doing is he's like condemning secular education. And it's like, buddy, in what way was Greco-Roman education in Corinth of the first century secular? You know, that's really imposing like a 20th century like culture war perspective on like a Jewish guy preaching to Greek people, but they're all under the same religion and they're intermixing their concepts. Like it's just not, as far as I can tell, realistic. But I saw it a couple places. But if anyone knows more about this idea that there was like a secular Corinth, hey, if somebody has better arguments, I'm interested.
Who is now? Because I know that term used to mean something different though. Secular. Because they had the secular games, which meant secular meant like I think it meant like every 100 years or something.
I think I'll dig into it. I don't want to go down this hole. I was just reading a couple of papers. For this one, it seemed to, this paper that I was looking at seemed to mean it in a non-religious way.
Yeah, because they're using it from now's definition and putting it back. I see what you're saying.
Yeah. But I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, no. I'll be a good seeker of knowledge. Yeah. But what I think is, and there are the other sort of scholarly perspectives is, well, maybe there was a Hellenistic Jewish group with beliefs similar to Philo, and it's something that's a lot like Philo, and they're having some sort of focus on wisdom, and Paul's trying to talk them out of it. And also just as like a quick growing religious group, like they're just like any religious group that is working to bring a lot of people in and grow quickly. Like we see it today in Christianity. Like
I think you can look at the Hypsisterians, the Greek monotheists that were thriving in that time period. I point to them as like those are the people who probably become Christians most likely.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, well, it also just seems like you can see in First Corinthians that because for there to be a struggle between the rich and the poor Christians in Corinth, that suggests that Christianity is spreading pretty widely. Because, I mean, to get a class struggle within a church, you have to be doing pretty good, you
Yeah,
know?
sure. And I always want to stress this when I'm talking about this is that how diverse all of these groups were that were sprouting up all over the Greece and Anatolia and North Africa. There wasn't like today you have they're Mormons and Catholics. We look at those two groups and they're like, they're so far apart. They're not even the same religion anymore. But in reality, when you compare the Mormons and what they believe to what the Catholics believe, they have a lot more in common than pick any two different Christian groups in the ancient world in the second century. They will be vastly different. They might worship, they have a different view of what God even is, let alone like if like I don't know if there was a different prophet named Joseph Smith or not. They don't. That's kindergarten compared to the stuff that these early Christians are getting at. And so we're talking about having people viewing the Old Testament God as evil versus not. Like we're totally in different worlds here compared to the vast groups of Christians today. They all agree on basically at least the Nicene Creed. So we're not even close to being this. So I just want to stress that, like the world that we're talking about, we have people who think a lot of different things, and there's not a lot in common other than they like Jesus. Like that's literally it. They just like Jesus.
And it's growing very quickly. And you can even see that in First Corinthians, where there's a part later in the book where Paul is talking like, hey, who are all apostles or all evangelists? You know, and one of the things that he's getting at is his claim to be an apostle. You can see how that's weathering because it, I'm not saying that Paul didn't have a vision on the road to Damascus where he met Jesus and received Gnosis from Jesus, which changed his life. However, a lot of people started claiming to have Gnosis in a similar way and to be apostles. And have you ever looked at the Didache much?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, so you know the thing in the Didache where it says apostles can only stay 2 days in one place?
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah.
So there seemed to be a thing in the early church where there was a problem where, and you can even see this once again in First Corinthians, where it talks about people speaking in the spirit and prophesying. But there seemed to be a problem where if you're speaking in the spirit, anything you say is, absolute law and absolute truth. And if you have a bunch of different people who are using the voice of God to try to impose their will on people, you can imagine how pretty quickly that would become a mess. So it's also just possible that one of the things that we're seeing in First Corinthians is literally just condemnation. Is if not a condemnation of like speaking in the spirit and doing spirit guided things, at least a creating room for people who don't and making it so that people don't like fully take over. But like Paul talks about in First Corinthians, how like he speaks in tongues. So I
Yeah,
definitely think
that's in 16, I think, chapter 16, I think it is, where
that's
he
right.
and I actually let me go to that real quick because I actually really like that. And the reason why I like this is because it really gives us a nice in-depth view of what these people were doing. So
Sure.
is it 16? I think it's 16, right?
Right. And I think, I have spent a lot of time talking to Pentecostals, and I think even today, I think that speaking in tongues and that sort of ecstatic experience is deeply meditative in a certain way.
Yeah.
And so I think that you can get an idea that there's a lot of exciting things going on in Corinth.
I also think what's going on here is like I'm not gonna say this is so how do I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. when we're talking about like speaking in tongues, and here it is, I found it. All right, let's just real quick. I just want to read this out real quick because this is interesting. He says, "Follow the way of love." Hold on, let me make this bigger. And eagerly desire, for anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people but to God. Well, this isn't exactly the same one. The where he talks about himself though, where he says like, "I am a symbol, like a flute." What is that? Shit. What verse is that again? Do you remember or no? Maybe.
But without love, I'm a clanging gong.
Yeah. That here it is, right here. Oh, is this it? No. Anyways, whatever. I'll find it later. But the way he's describing it, it comes off as very Orphic. Like it's like this, like we're all getting the spirit, we're all singing our hymns, and we're speaking in tongues. Then there's tongues of angels, and then there's tongues of humans. We're in the. He's like, there's like this different like mode that they're in. It's almost like a Bacchic feel, because when you look at the reason why I say that is because when you look at the Bacchic tradition, they were into that. They were into that revelry. Everybody would just go wild and start, just going mad. That they call it divine madness. And so,
let's bring in a little Plotinus.
Yeah,
Plotinus is anti-Gnostic.
He writes about this divine madness. Plotinus does.
He does.
Yeah.
So the Gnostics that Plotinus is condemning are also engaged in ecstatic worship and are also using what Plotinus sees as nonsense phrases. But there's like a hissing noise and there's a popping noise. But I think if you look at it, there's a very similar ecstatic state with a ecstatic speaking from the spirit that sounds like nonsense to outsiders. But this is like very common, not just in the Gnosticism that Plotinus is talking about, but also in like the stuff we see in the Greek magical papyri.
Yeah, exactly.
And they also show up in like Zostrianus and I think Pistis Sophia.
I found that verse. This is such a perfect example. So this is coming from Paul himself. And he says, I speak in tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love. I am only resounding a gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy, I can fathom all the mysteries and all knowledge. Which again, in Greek, that means that's Gnosis, is what people thought of knowledge as some sort of divine, you know what I mean? Especially in this context. So, and then if I have faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, I have nothing. So, and here he is talking about boasting over knowledge later on. So this ties in too. But the reason why I'm showing this is like that when I'm reading this, and I have like now that I know about ancient mystery religions and how the Greek religions and how the certain rites were done, I'm thinking like, is this what he's talking about? Again, I might not be, but it sounds a lot like he's getting at some sort of divine madness revelry thing going on.
Yeah, I mean, literally, that's what like speaking in tongues is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Look, I'm not saying that I can guarantee that, but I'm saying, like, honestly, if I had a bet, I would say, yeah, just me, just personally, you know.
But I mean, I think that also you look at like ancient authors, like these things are deeply connected. But let's go into this a little more deeply.
Yeah.
So I don't want to lose the Plotinus part, just because, well, it turns out Christians love to wonder what was going on.
I felt like Exmo. I felt like an alien in my first Catholic mass.
Hey, it happens. There's some like French writer who said, you know, and he was a wit, and he says after going to a Protestant church for the first time, at least in Latin, you can't tell how silly it all sounds.
Right. That's such a true point.
So Plotinus starts out his condemnations of Gnosticism with, frankly, a discussion of his understanding of the sort of ladder of reality, where at the top you have the first principle, the unmoved mover, the transcendent God. Then you have the intelligible gods, and then you have like the sublunar gods, and then you have like humanity. And there's a lot, and he admits that there's a lot of complication here. But you know, he basically says there's the one God comes to know itself, which produces the soul, and then the all soul creates reality. And while things in reality are based on the higher things, and by like sort of their nature, they're not as good as the higher things. Like you can't be as good as God, even if you're in the created image of God. But that's just, I mean, there's nothing like fundamentally wrong with being lower on the ladder of creation, because like you just are. And even in the higher ladder of creation, nothing can be generated in like a process way, but rather exists from all eternity as it is. And so the big point that Plotinus says is basically there's the one God, then there are the intelligible gods created by the all soul. But and then like the gods are the images of reality, etc., like the forms. But one of the points he makes is there isn't anything bad going on here. Like, this is the best possible world, even though there are things, he says, that can like shock you in the world. Like, even those are just extreme less good versions of good things, and there's nothing like fundamentally different. You look at what Paul is saying in First Corinthians. Paul is saying there is a wisdom of this world and there is a wisdom of Christ. Like, Paul and Plotinus are not on board with the idea, or like Paul is saying that there is something wrong here where the lower powers are fundamentally different than the higher power. It is not that the world is perfectly good and a perfectly good representation of what the highest God wants. And that can seem like a minor quibble, but those are very different ways of looking at the world. And I think this can really come up. Do you want to go back to chapter 8 of First Corinthians and just want to read through it quickly?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. Let me pull that out. Yeah, because that's yeah, he really gets into this Gnosis thing here. So let me just switch over my screen. I wish you could have more than one screen pulled up at a time. For some reason, StreamYard doesn't do that yet, but hopefully they'll figure that out one day. Anyways, so the first part you're talking about?
Yeah.
Now about food sacrificed to idols. We know that we all possess Gnosis, but Gnosis puffs up while the love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know, but whoever loves Theos is known by Theos. Want to keep going?
Yeah.
So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no Theos but one. For even I like using the Greek because it makes it feel more real to me. I don't know why I do that.
You know, even the ancient who are the ones before the Babylonians?
Sumerians.
Yeah, the Sumerians, even they used words that they took from the Elamites.
Yeah, that's what I like. That's what I like. I like to do the same thing.
Oh, yeah, no, humans love old words.
Yeah, for even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, for yet us there is one but Theos, the Father, from whom all things come and from whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things come and through whom we live. But okay, go. I'll stop there.
All right, well, let's talk about
this. Is the part where I think we're getting at though, but not everyone possesses this Gnosis.
Yeah.
Right. Which is what does he mean by this Gnosis? There's a different Gnosis. That's we're talking about like that word, not knowledge. In English, it just means one thing, knowledge. But wow, this knowledge? What do you mean this knowledge? That's that Gnosis. That's that Gnosis that the early Christians were getting at.
Right. So first, I just think it's important to look at what Paul is saying here about the little g gods. Because, like, first, I'm sure that the audience knows, but these quotes around gods and lords, that there were not quotes in the original manuscripts of Paul. This is added in to sort of make sense of this. And I think it's a legitimate thing, but I also think it's important for us to like grapple with the fact that Paul is talking to Greek speaking Hellenistic people who until recently were polytheists. So when talking about there being so-called gods and many lords, like that's a very different experience in talking to a first century Roman person than it is talking to us, where monotheism is sort of the default to such a serious degree. But I think what you can see here is that Paul is engaging with concepts of polytheism, where he is both saying, if there is something there, it's evil, but it's probably not even there. And this is a fundamentally different way of looking at the gods than what Plotinus has. So I think that when we talk about Gnosticism, big G Gnosticism, the brand name stuff, we are so often focused on the idea that the God of the Hebrews is a fake as being this really shocking central thing. And in many ways, it is modern. Anti-Semites love it. People hurt by Abrahamic religions love it.
Right.
But let's not get overwhelmed, because for many people in the Hellenistic polytheistic world, it was just as shocking for them to hear that the gods, all, Isis and Apollo and Hermes and everybody, to hear that they weren't real, or if they were real, were just sort of bad and a trick.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what we often think of, quote unquote, Gnosticism saying about the God of the Hebrews.
Right.
That was just as shocking to them. And like Plotinus's big thing is Plotinus is defending both the reality and the morality of the little g gods. He says, hey, they are not bad. They understand the true God much better than we possibly could. They love the true God better. They are capable of looking on the true God and looking on the true,
In fact, Hermes is called angelos, which is angel. We think of it as angel, but that word was used as messenger.
Yeah.
And then in the Hermetica text, he's called the logos, the word, because he's the mouthpiece of Zeus. He's the one coming back and forth, he's the mediator, if you will, which are all things that we attribute to the angels or Jesus.
Oh, sure. I mean, look, there's weird stuff going on. Like the Wotan, the king of the Anglo-Saxon gods, was compared not to Zeus, but
Mercury.
to Hermes.
Yeah, Hermes, Mercury.
Yeah. So anyway, I understand there's so much I need to learn, but in this case, like I think it's easy for us to miss this, but like Paul's willingness to sort of quote unquote demonize the pagan gods is itself, and the idea that the knowledge that the pagan gods are either not real or bad, that is itself sort of Gnosticism. I mean, and keep going with the reading, because we're about to get in at verse 7 here to literally Paul talking about the different groups of Christians, some with Gnosis, some without, which is the classic dynamic of Gnosticism.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. Not everyone possesses this Gnosis. Some people are still accustomed to idols, that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god. And since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. Let me just pull down this a little bit.
Right. And so, like, this is continuing this idea where like the gods are totally disempowered. Because it's not just saying, oh, stay away from that, because if you eat meat sacrificed to idols, it makes you worse. This is just saying it doesn't matter.
Yeah, yeah. It's
It's
saying
like,
that you're strong and you're conscious because it has no power over you, basically. But a weaker Christian will think it's like a demon, right?
right. And you can keep going.
All right. Be careful, however, and this is where he switches it up a little bit, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone with a weak conscience sees you with all your gnosis eating in an idol's temple, won't the person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother or sister from whom Christ died is destroyed by your gnosis. When you sin against them in this way, and your wound and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or other sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall. Bam.
Yeah. So, once again, we're like in the concept, we're in the territory of wisdom and like what's going on here. And I think it's also important. So much about Gnosticism is about the question of like, how can gnosis actually be transmitted? How do you get gnosis? And once you have gnosis, how do you, or even can you pass it on? And so I think what we see here is not exactly what Plotinus is doing, because Plotinus is very anti-Gnosticism. Although even Plotinus is like, look, you need gnosis, but you have to understand that the true gnosis is that the gods are good and you should do what I say.
Yeah, didn't Porphyry write something against the Gnostics too?
I think Porphyry labeled what Plotinus wrote. I don't
Yeah,
know that.
that's probably
I'll
what.
admit it. I don't know that much about Porphyry. Slap the cuffs on and take me to jail.
Yeah, no, it's but you're right though. I just want people, just so people to know, Plotinus, and he has a whole chapter. You probably can't even see that. Let me just make this bigger real quick. I just want to show them just the title of it. Against the Gnostics,
Yeah.
or against those that affirm that the creator of the cosmos is itself evil. So, so the reason why I'm showing that, like, Plotinus is very famous, and obviously we have a lot of his stuff being handed down, and he's the successor to what goes back eventually to Plato. Like, he's that guy. He's
And
very,
he hated important Christians too, like
yeah.
Augustine. Like,
And the reason why this is such a big deal is because the way we think of Gnostics and heretics is like they were just a bunch of fringe groups, no one cared, because we think of them as, we think of like post-Nicene Creed Christianity as being the only thing, Orthodox. But the real deal, these people were so relevant that Plotinus had to write about them.
and I also think it's very important to realize that Gnostics were not unique not sexts. That it was not like, well, we have the real Christians over here, the real Hellenistic pagans over here, and over here the crazy freaking.
Yeah, they were part of everything. They were part of the world. Like, they were part of it.
It's more like in the same. I mean, I think going back to the speaking in tongues and this sort of ecstatic experience stuff, like ecstatic experience and meditation is something that arises it, arises a lot in a lot of different forms of Christianity. Like, look at how many different forms of Christianity. Like, you can look at the spread of Pentecostalism, but then you also look at these medieval saints like Teresa of Avila, and it seems like this ecstatic experience reaching out to God, and through this ecstatic experience having some sort of direct experience of God, that's very old and that's around a lot. And I think in the same, but at the same time, that like you can see from the spread of Pentecostalism, it also really helps to have some tradition attached to it. So it's both something that can sort of boil up naturally, but it's also something where it really helps if you have a little bit of attachment. I think that Gnosticism is a lot more like ecstatic worship in that it's something that can fit into a lot of different religious groups, and it's something that you can sort of get to some version. Because, like, you look, like, it wouldn't surprise me if sort of Hellenistic Greek stuff like Philo did play a part. It wouldn't surprise me if, like, sophist fighting and Stoic philosophy played some part in what's happening in Corinth. Um, so this is where I sort of talk about queer theory and just saying there are a lot of there are a lot of weird interconnected variations. And so I think while probably the people at Corinth, I don't think the people at Corinth had the secret book of John, but I think they were well on their way to something. But even then, you can say, like, there's this other part where Paul is talking about people speaking in the Spirit, and he says, only by speaking in the Spirit can you say Christ is good, but no one speaking in the Spirit can like condemn Christ. And so there's an idea, maybe this is about some sort of Gnostic or Donatist thing where they're saying that Christ didn't come in person and that the crucifix, because Paul also in First Corinthians hits the reality of the crucifixion very hard. And frankly, I do think that there's a question of whether or not the rulers of this age that Paul is talking about in First Corinthians are the same thing as like the God of this world that he's talking about, or how he's talking about the gods and lords in chapter 8, or like literal human authorities who crucified Jesus.
Yeah.
But but I also think it's open. But I think at some point, what was it? What was I saying?
We're talking about the well, I was gonna say because Paul.
Oh no, this is where Paul says about no one can say damn Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. You lose your train of thought occasionally. But so what this could be is that because so much of Gnosticism is about identifying God and saying, oh, that God you believe is perfect, that's the fake God.
Right.
So it's even possible from this comment about no one speaking in the Spirit can say damn Jesus or whatever it is exactly, that could be a Gnostic formula where you have to even accept that Jesus is bad.
Well, also, even if Paul's not directly, making the claims about the Old Testament God sort of being some sort of other thing, some other Marcion does. By the way, Marcion claims to be a student of Paul. You know that, right?
Oh, sure. Everybody claims.
And actually, some scholars say that Marcion's the reason why we have Paul's letters, because he kept them all in one spot. But
you look at the Gospel of Philip and you know what New Testament?
Yeah,
the Gospel of Philip quotes First Corinthians.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. But what I'm saying is Paul, when he talks about the law being bondage, the way he's sort of like others himself and opposes Old Testament Torah stuff can make you wonder if he is in that line of thinking, that Gnostic line of thinking, where you're opposing the you're opposing the law, you're saying the law is bondage, and like I wonder if there's a little bit of a layer there. He doesn't really specifically say anything bad about the Old Testament God, but I'm saying the way that he speaks of the law being bondage, that's heavy. That's a heavy charge. You know what I mean?
I mean, I know that there were later Gnostics who took Paul's comment about the Torah being brought by an angel in the book of Galatians as Paul saying that, oh, well, that angel is the Jewish God, and therefore, blah, 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 demiurge.
Right.
I just don't know if I think that's what
Yeah, it is a bit of it is a bit of speculative
I
speculation.
mean,
Yeah.
I definitely think that between like I believe in the 60 years between when First Corinthians is written and when we start seeing a lot of Gnostic texts in the early second century, 80, 60, 80 years, give me a break. I think there's this huge proliferation of myth making, and and there are people speaking in the spirit, and you have a bunch of people speaking in the spirit. Then you can get a lot of deeply, deeply complex cosmological conceptions. And you see, going back to Plotinus, like Plotinus really has a bone to pick with the Gnostics over how complicated their designs of divine emanation are. He just feels they're too complicated, they don't make sense, you don't need all, oh, we're gonna have an aeon for thinking and
Aeon,
for,
yeah, for everything.
do you
So
need an aeon for knowing your own thinking as well as the aeon for thinking? Oh, this is
proud.
just crazy.
Yeah,
How many fucking aeons are there?
yeah.
Yeah, which I think, hey, I, I have read enough Gnostic texts that at least I have sympathy for that perspective. But at the same time, I think that the complication of what's going on in the pleroma and and what I think you could call the drama of the cosmic tragedy, trying to map that out and all these wacky, complicated myths, they're frankly one of the big functional things of Gnosticism.
Right,
They're
like the claim of saying that Yaldabaoth, who is the Old Testament God, he just thought that he was creating this world, that he was under some sort of like magical spell on by Sophia. He just thought like he was mistaken the whole like imagine like being a Jewish person, I don't know, Alexandria, or maybe you're from Jerusalem and you go to Alexandria, and then some guy, so you're talking to some guy at the Alexandria library, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you know your God is actually not the real one, and he's mistaken." They'd be like, "What are you talking about? That's crazy!" Like it's a big claim to make against someone else's. You know what I mean?
I mean, people love this stuff. It's exciting these days. But I think it's hard. I mean, I think genuinely First Corinthians is a very exciting text because there's a lot going on, and Paul is not being specific. But I'll tell you one thing that I really think that Paul doesn't do, and that Paul benefits a lot from. And you might think I'm wrong. Paul never gets specific about what's going on in heaven exactly, like the process by which it all fits together. Besides, what Paul does is brings it back to, hey, we all gotta love each other and believe, and our faith is in Christ crucified and not in all these words and craziness. And that's such a powerful position. I recently heard about some archaeological hoax where some British paleontologist like planted a fake ancient human skeleton, and to get away with it, they left the jaw hinge off so that you couldn't. And I feel like with Paul, when it comes to like how exactly do all the divine emanations fit together? Where does the God of this world come from? Where do all these demons come from? Paul is kind of not giving us those hinge points with a
Right.
lot of specific. And I think that one of the reasons he's not doing that is because he is really emphasizing that, like, coming together as a community, not committing. I mean, look, I really like when you look at the sex problems in Corinth. I like, look, I love LGBT people. I'm all pro LGBT all the time. There's a new. I live in North Carolina.
I didn't know that about you.
You haven't noticed? There's a new anti-trans law in that passed the Senate where I live here in North Carolina. So I'll fight for fucking ever. But I think that at the same time, churches are communities of extreme trust and connection. And when there's sexual abuse in churches, it's some of the worst things ever. And it does sound like that there was sexual abuse happening in the church at Corinth. And so it always does seem like, there are complications around the Christian sexual ethic because it is so important that no one be hurt. And you can often fall back into legalism, no homosexuality, no women with hair uncovered speaking in church. But I think even those are falling back into the trap of looking for a specific wisdom to solve all problems instead of accepting that there are complex needs. But anyway, I just think that this is, to me, 1 Corinthians is just absolutely fascinating. And
very strange text.
Anyway, I think probably, I'll bet Plotinus would have just hated Paul. I would love to see them counter condemnation.
Or Celsus versus Paul would be good too.
Man, when I get my time machine
imagine if they were alive today, those people, imagine them on social media, on Twitter, on debating each other on these things. Oh, I would get my popcorn ready for that. Paul versus Plotinus.
Paul would get canceled for saying virtus est, be a man.
Yeah, or women cover your hair when you walk into church, women. Or you can't be a preacher. What are you talking about? Yeah,
look, I really think he's talking about some sort of Gnostic higher level stuff, and that he is not giving specific, and that's not just me because, hey, look, do I like preaching in church? Of course I like preaching. He had to talk about Jesus to people. I'm not going to turn down that opportunity. But I think, I don't know. I think that this is the problem with Paul, is that I'm like, Paul, what are you saying about gnosis and gender here? And I would just like to ask a few clarifying questions. But I don't know. I think, and I guess the big question that I'm still trying to work out with Paul is so Plotinus has everything so tightly worked out, because for Plotinus, you have the big God, and you have the little gods, then you have the created world, and the little gods are based on the big God, and the little gods make the created world based on the big God. And, and things are rough, but we all have our place, and it can be shocking, but it's all for the best. This is the best possible world, and, hey, I'll say, you can see why such a system would be very comforting, and how you could run an empire for 1,000 years. You can see why Hellenistic religion worked.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think anytime we try to understand the New Testament, especially Paul, outside of Hellenistic religion, we're doomed, because Paul is specifically working on Hellenistic.
Yeah, this one's been up for a long time, so I'm just going to read it. Thank you, Max, for the super chat. Really appreciate you. And also, I noticed you just joined as a member. Thank you so much, Max. I love seeing you in the chat, and I'm glad to see you do that. Thank you. I'm Eastern Orthodox, so our soteriology relies on Greek. Paul uses what is that word? Energumenon to explain the Spirit working in you. This term is used in Aristotle to contemplate God, invocations of Apollo, and experiencing daimons. Wow, that's a good note.
I think Paul also, or not Paul, but Plotinus uses this when he is talking about, because Plotinus is very defensive about the idea that the gods could be bad or immoral. And Paul seems to have no problem with that. But one of Plotinus's real defenses of the gods not being bad is because they are constantly viewing the true God, and through viewing the true God are taking on this. So I don't fully understand the Eastern Orthodox stuff, even though I go to Eastern Orthodox church sometimes. And
I
I'm
thought
gonna.
didn't you say you used to stay at a one of those, what do you call them? I forgot what they're called, but didn't you stay for a while? Like, weren't you staying somewhere?
I have had a lot of contact with Eastern Orthodox monasticism.
Yeah, yeah, those places, monasteries.
I've done a few. I was one when I was young. I was invited. This is before I transitioned. When I was still in the army, I was invited by a family friend to go to Mount Athos, but they only accept men, and I didn't want to like lie. But no, I mean, I think Eastern Orthodox.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Well, I mean, you gotta have you know. I mean, yeah, yeah. What does the gospel say about going in through the front gate? But
Well,
anyway,
well, anyway, this comment is interesting though by Max, because he's right about this, is that Christianity is still operating within the framework of Greek religion. Like, even though it's not, even though like Houses always talks about how the Christians, they want to other themselves, and they want to just be on a different plane than us. But like, there's certain things that you do when you're doing religion. There's like certain like motions to go through that all religions have to do, certain terminology, that thing, the idea of sacrificing, the idea of, taking part in certain rites like the Eucharist. Those are things you would see in the Eleusinian mysteries. They would eat the bread and drink the wine, and then they had Bacchus and Demeter, represented by the bread and the wine. So there are certain things in Christian religion that sort of, not, I'm like, it's like, I don't want to say polemicize, but like, it mirrors it a little bit. Like, they're still operating in a framework of the religious world of the West, Roman Greece area, you know.
indeed. And I just looked this up. So this isn't a word that gets used in First Corinthians, but it turns up a lot of other places in Paul, and it is connected to in
You want to share your screen or no?
no.
You don't have to. I'm just
But yeah, I'm over on Blue Letter Bible, but it's used in Ephesians to talk about and what is the exceeding greatness of his power to us toward who we believe according to the working, and that's this word, the working of his mighty power. And he talks about the working of his power more there, but he also in Second Thessalonians talks about even him whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders. So this reference like supernatural working is something that, according to Paul, both God and the devil can do. So that's really interesting, because I guess that is also how Paul can see both positive and negative spiritual forces having some ability to do work within the physical world. That's interesting. That's a cool thing. Thanks for bringing that forward.
Yeah, definitely. That was a good comment. Thank you, Max. Natalia Emerson says, "Do you think the Therapeutai were proto-Christians?" It's an interesting question. Do you know what the Therapeutai are? They're from Philo. Philo writes about them, and then I think someone else writes about them too. I can't remember who. Oh, Josephus. I'm pretty sure.
I
They're
don't know much about therapeutic.
they're a group of people living in Alexandria, Egypt, that are compared to the Essenes, and they're basically these people that are, I guess a lot of people like compare them to cynics or stoics as well, and like, they live like a life of poverty outside of like needing things, and very like, yeah, I can see why
Jewish group.
no, well, yeah, some of them. So that was what I think, that's what Philo was talking about them, as of like, they're in their own different sect, but they're also, he compares it. So I think there were Jewish Therapeutai. We don't know much about them beyond that, though. So I don't know. I would say, I was just reading something about the Therapeutai too, about them having something to do with the Orphic Bacchic tradition too. Something there. I forgot who said that. Damn, I wish I oh, I think it's in this actually. I think I'm holding it right. I think I was just scrolling through this actually, and I saw it in here. Actually, I think I can find it because I knew I just read it somewhere, but I just didn't remember where. But I think I could find it actually. I think it's in here. Um, Give me 1 second. I know exactly where it is. Oh, there we go. That's all right. I'll fix this in a second. But yeah, no, this is actually interesting. Natalia, I'm glad you asked this. Let me just pull this up real quick. It's in the Philo section in here. Let's see, 229. This is in Marvin Meyer's Mysteries book, and it says about Philo in the Philo section. It says, 220. Did I say 229?
Something like that.
Here it is. The
Well, you know,
Therapeutai.
Cameron
It says
died.
the Therapeutai participated in ceremonies resembling some of those mystery religions. Philo portrays them with the with terms derived from the mysteries, especially the Bacchic mysteries. And so, yeah, I don't know. There's such a mysterious group of people that I really wished we had more information on them. But anyways, the long story short is there a group of people in Alexandria, Egypt in the 1st century, and they were, yeah, that's pretty much what we know.
Yeah. Well, I think in much the same way that I think you have to understand these traditions as sort of forming and crystallizing in different places. I think a lot of the stuff from Philo and other Hellenistic writers in Alexandria, I really think that they added so much to early Christianity. And I think you can sort of precipitate out specific beliefs and practices. So, it just seems to me that in the early 1st century, there was a huge movement of Hellenistic Jews who had increasingly complex ideas about holy wisdom. And there were also a lot of pagans who were becoming more and more interested in the Jewish God and in Jewish mysticism. And I think that you can see this heavily in the Greek magical papyri, which often include formulas around the Jewish God. But you can also see it in Jewish stuff. Like, this is not a one-way transfer.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff moving back and forth. And so you have this mix of aesthetic, being ascetics. You have people who are doing ecstatic religion. And, like, frankly, with Bacchus and that sort of thing, with a lot of the mystery religions, you're having holy sex.
Right.
And it seems like, to me, it seems like you have a lot of pre existing things. And then Christianity both gets more popular and gives all of these different traditions and ideas a place to settle. But then the interconnection of the Christian community processes all this stuff in a way that it hasn't been fully processed before. With, like, the book of First Corinthians itself being, we have this major Christian leader, Paul, who is talking to a large Christian community that has both rich and poor members. And the rich and poor members are drawn to slightly different spiritualities. But there's a lot of innovation and experimentation and spiritual adventure happening. So Paul is kind of trying to ride herd. And it does seem like a major part of what is going on in Corinth is this idea that you can do different things depending on what spiritual gnosis you have. And so, like, I think it's really easy to dismiss the Gnosticness, if you will, of what's going on in Corinth. But genuinely, I think people are after gnosis, and maybe the full concept of what gnosis is still trying to be figured out. And so what Paul is saying is kind of, don't worry about the gods, just focus on Christ crucified.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. But at the same time, from Plotinus's perspective, like, Paul is totally out of line with Plotinus.
Yeah. What does Plotinus like? I don't know how much Plotinus you read, but does he say anything about like Orthodox Christians in general either, or does he not even go there?
I don't really know much, but about statues, I have a fun quote from him because he also talks about like his understanding of gods and statues, which with chapter 8 of First Corinthians is really useful. So this is from the third Ennead. He says, the content of the creative soul includes the ideal shapes of gods and of all else, and hence it is that the cosmos contains all. I think, therefore, that those ancient sages who sought to secure the presence of divine beings by the erection of shrines and statues showed insight into the nature of the all. They perceived that through this soul, though the soul is everywhere tractable, the presence will be secured all the more readily when an appropriate receptacle is elaborated. A place especially capable of receiving some portion or phase of it, something reproducing it or representing it and serving like a mirror to catch an image of it. So, like, you can see that for the Greeks, these idols, these statues, very much had magical theological meaning. And so, really, just the fact that Paul is saying, nah, not really, like that is itself. And I guess this is my main. Paul is saying, yeah, that this is basically Gnosticism of a sort. So that's pretty much what I got for you tonight.
No, this has been fun, and I think there's no more super chats. I don't see any, but yeah, that was a good point, Natalie. Thank you for that super chat. I just want to see if we got any comments recently in the last 10, 15 minutes or so that have anything to do with this. Plato isn't representative of all Greek thinking. Good point. The Epicureans definitely didn't like everything Plato had to say, and Platonists definitely didn't like Epicurus either. That's for sure.
And Plotinus talks about Epicurus
Yeah.
because in the same way that we have the Gnostics of First Corinthians are having a lot of sex and shocking people. That's also something Plotinus says that his Gnostic students are doing. So the idea of Epicurus as like we should live and have fun. Like that also comes into Gnostic thought and gets condemned by both the Christian and the pagans upset about it. So that's a good point.
Yeah. Pseudo Cello says Plotinus is amazing. Destroys Epicurus and Gnostic immorality. I'm actually my thinking, if I was in the ancient world, I'd be an Epicurean. I think they make the most sense. I just like, I don't know. They just resonate with my thoughts,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I would probably I don't know. I wouldn't like sometimes I'm like, well, I'd just be a monastic so I could like read all day, but it just everybody seems like they had a hard life 2,000 years ago. I'm very selfish and
as beautiful as the ancient world would have looked like, it was probably rough.
And it probably smelled like.
Yeah. Imagine going to the bath. People don't realize you don't even have a bathroom in your house. You got to go to. You're going to the local bathroom where there's a bunch of rocks, a bunch of stone toilets. Have you ever seen one before? I saw one when I was in Israel.
Buddy,
I was like, no, there's no way. You mean everyone's sitting in here and shitting at the same time and on these stones? Yeah, this is what there was. And then
I have seen some rough latrines in
the Romans had a bucket of water basically with sponges in them for you to wipe with, and then you would dip it in the public water and use that. Like, how did it not have black plagues every weekend?
They had a bunch of plagues.
Yeah.
Have you heard like the plague of Justinian?
Yeah. Oh, that wiped out like half the world. Yeah.
Let's just. What a fun way to end out a discussion.
That's crazy.
But no, I mean, although it is interesting also that both of these talk about spiritual healing, where Plotinus is against spiritual healing. Plotinus is upset at people who think that you can do healings through exorcisms, where Paul seems like Paul seems like, hey, you can do exorcisms, just like be nice
Yeah.
to one another. I just
Well,
think it's really funny
but what
how
also
much Paul falls under Plotinus's definition of a
I
Gnostic.
agree. No, I think you made that point pretty clear. I think I'm sold on it at least. But I do want to say one last thing because you made a good point about Plotinus is against Paul's thinking, but people like to think that the Platonists were more rational, more scientific, more but actually they believed in magic more than the Christians did.
Well, let me tell you a story about Plotinus, because like Plotinus, okay, so this is a delicate point, but Plotinus's complaint about Gnostics isn't that they're doing magic, but that they believe A, that exorcisms can cure ill health, which he doesn't seem to believe, but also they seem to believe the Gnostics among his disciples seem to think that their magic can be binding on not just the lower gods, but on the highest god. And Plotinus just is up. He just hates this idea. Um, and so I just think it's wild because like one of the things that it's just this idea that in the highest eternal, there is no movement, there is no process, there is no change. And so, therefore, no magic can work. And I don't know, it's just funny to me because I think also in some ways Paul sees a more active God who is maybe less understandable, but who is more active in the world.
Yeah. Also, I think that psychology would have been seen to them as some sort of form of magic. They would have called it magic in the ancient
I
world.
think psychology might still be magic.
Yeah.
But
Well, Young would say that. Carl Jung would say it's magic.
yeah.
But
But in
yeah,
but but no, I mean, I think Plotinus is fast. I think Plotinus is a really interesting dude. But like, oh, I was going to tell you this story
oh, yeah,
from some
oh,
other ancient source. So when Plotinus was once just a little baby student, and there was another student who got mad at Plotinus and attempted to use negative magic on him, but due to the virtue of Plotinus's soul, the magic rebounded off of him and onto the guy who was trying to do magic at him. So
wow.
it was just known that Plotinus was of such high virtue that you couldn't even do magic on him.
You know that Plotinus, that's a cool story actually. If you know that Plotinus's teacher was Ammonius Saccas,
I've
and
heard that.
yeah, he was they said he's self-taught, but like I think there's a connection with him and Plutarch at some point somewhere too. I forgot who said that. I'm looking through it right now to see if I can find anything, but I can't. Forgot who said that. But anyways, yeah, it says he's self-taught, which is interesting. The teacher of Plotinus was self-taught? That's interesting. But
I mean, was he rich? Did he?
I don't know. He must have been chilling in either Pergamum or Alexandria to know all that, to be able to self-teach yourself in the ancient world without the internet. Like I can't even. He must have been some sort of wizard or something. But I'm pretty sure he probably was hanging out in the Alexandrian library. Oh yeah, born in Alexandria, died in Alexandria. I was right. Good call.
Yeah, that would help being
Yeah,
so.
yeah, that makes sense. So he probably sitting in the library just reading ancient texts, reading Plutarch, reading whatever, and became a teacher.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. But anyways, I just wanted to. I don't know. Anything else you want to talk about? I'm in no rush to leave anytime soon, but we can end it now. Like, this was a cool conversation.
I think that's kind of all I have. I mean, I think, oh, just as a last thing, I'll just say I think the study of Pauline demonology or daemonology, however you want to say it, I think to me a lot of the biggest questions about what's going on in Paul are around like him talking about the God of this world and the daemons. And I think maybe in First Corinthians is the closest you can get to him really opening up to like what he thinks is going on here. And I don't know. I just am absolutely fascinated by it, and I look forward to continuing to learn more. So anyway, it was great talking to you tonight. I gotta get ready for work in the morning because I'm just a poor media worker, hammering away at the working around climate media. So I don't know.
This means great. There could be multiple of them. Yeah. Actually, I'm pretty sure there was another Ammonius of Alexandria. Yeah, and they live around the same time. There's a few people. There's a few people in history like that, where there'll be two people with the same name from the same city in the same century, and then people will be like, "Oh, like Pythagoras is one of those." There was two Pythagorases living in 500 BCE. There's a couple other ones like that too, but anyway.
No, I'm not that. But I'm not the triangle guy.
Yeah,
Just
different one. Yeah. But yeah, that's interesting. But anyways, this has been great. Your Twitter link is in the description. Go and follow Vivian on Twitter, and you have just attained true Gnosis.
You have just attained true Gnosis. The Demiurge has no power over you.